They laughed when no one bid a single dollar for her. By nightfall, those same men would not dare meet her eyes. The wooden platform creaked under her weight as she stood there, wrists marked by old rope, chin lifted just enough to catch the last stretch of afternoon light, the kind that turns dust into gold and men into judges. Boots scraped against dry earth, low murmurs passing through the crowd like wind through brittle grass. But no one stepped forward, not even out of curiosity, not even for pity. The auctioneer cleared his throat, spat to the side, and tried again, his voice louder this time, as if volume could manufacture value where none was seen. Strong enough for work, quiet type, no trouble if handled right. But even he didn't sound convinced, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any price ever spoken. A fly buzzed near her cheek. She didn't flinch. A man in the front row leaned on the railing, squinting like he was trying to decide if she was worth the space she occupied, then shook his head and stepped back, boots crunching slow, deliberate, final. Someone chuckled. Someone else muttered. Apache, like it explained everything and nothing at once. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the square, wrapping around her feet like something trying to pull her under, and still, nothing. No hand raised. No coin offered. Not even an insult loud enough to break the weight of that quiet rejection. The auctioneer's voice dropped, almost tired now. Take her for free then, he said, not angry, just done, as if she were an item left too long on a shelf, as if the world had already decided her worth, and he was only repeating it out loud. A boy near the edge picked up a pebble and tossed it lightly toward the platform, not to hurt, just to see if she would react, but she didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give him the satisfaction of proof that she felt anything at all, and somehow that unsettled them more than if she had shouted. A breeze rolled through the street, carrying the smell of leather, horses, and something older, something the town had long forgotten how to name. That was when he arrived, not with noise, not with urgency, just a figure at the far edge of the crowd, hat pulled low, coat worn thin at the elbows. The kind of man people noticed only after he had already been standing there a while. Elias Carter didn't step forward right away. He watched. Not her, at first, but them. The way they looked at her. The way they chose not to look. The way men who prided themselves on knowing value suddenly found none when it stood right in front of them. His fingers rested loosely near his belt, not on a weapon, not in tension, just still, like a man measuring something no one else could see. The auctioneer glanced his way, hope flickering for half a second before fading. You here to bid, Carter? He called out, voice edged with impatience. Elias didn't answer. Not yet. His eyes finally moved to the woman on the platform, taking in the dust on her dress, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the silence she carried like it belonged to her, not forced upon her, and something in that stillness held. The kind of stillness that wasn't empty, but waiting. The crowd shifted, restless now, ready to move on, ready to forget her the moment they turned their backs, because forgetting was easier than understanding. And for a moment, Elias almost did the same. Almost turned. Almost walked away like the rest of them. But then the light shifted just enough to reveal the faint line of bruising at her wrist, old but not forgotten, and the smallest tightening of her fingers against the wood beneath her. Not fear, not weakness, control. And that stopped him. The kind of detail most men never saw. The kind that changed everything once you did. The auctioneer shifted his weight, tapping the heel of his boot against the platform as if impatience alone might force a decision out of a crowd that had already made up its mind, and the sound echoed in the dry air, hollow, final, like a door closing somewhere no one wanted to acknowledge. Last call, he muttered, though there had never been a first, his voice losing the edge of authority and settling into something closer to resignation, because even a man who traded in people could tell when there was no profit left in pretending. Ayanna did not look at him. Her gaze stayed level, somewhere beyond the heads of the crowd, fixed on a distance that did not exist in that small town square, and the longer she held it, the more uncomfortable the people became, as if she were seeing something about them they could not hide. A woman near the back pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, whispering to the man beside her, "There is something wrong with her," and he nodded too quickly, grateful for an explanation that required no thought. The sheriff stood off to the side, thumbs hooked into his belt, eyes moving between the platform and the restless crowd, not intervening, not encouraging, just waiting for it to end so the town could return to the kind of order that did not ask questions. Ayana's breathing remained steady, slow, controlled, each breath measured like someone who understood that showing anything more would be taken, twisted, used against her, and the dust clung to the hem of her dress as the wind shifted again, brushing past her ankles, carrying with it the faint scent of sage from somewhere beyond the town limits. Elias noticed that too. He noticed everything now. The way her shoulders did not slump despite the weight of silence pressing down on her. The way her hands rested open at her sides, not clenched, not pleading, simply there, as if she had already accepted something the others had not yet understood. He took a single step forward, not enough to draw attention, but enough to change the way the ground felt beneath his boots, and the boards of the platform gave a soft groan in response, a sound that seemed louder now that the crowd had fallen into that uneasy quiet. The auctioneer saw the movement and straightened slightly, hope flickering again like a stubborn ember. "You got an offer, Carter, or are you just here to watch?" he asked, louder this time, trying to pull him into the center of it. Elias did not answer right away. His eyes moved from the auctioneer to the sheriff, then across the faces in the crowd, reading them the way a man reads weather on the horizon, looking for signs of what was coming, and finding only the same thing repeated over and over again. Certainty without understanding. Ayana's gaze shifted then, just once, just enough to meet his, and in that brief moment something passed between them, not recognition, not trust, but awareness, as if they both understood that this was the point where something small could become something else entirely. She did not speak. She did not ask. She simply looked, and then she looked away, returning to that distant horizon only she seemed to see. The auctioneer exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That is it then," he said, raising his hand as if to signal the end of something that had never properly begun. "She goes back." And the words hung there, unfinished, because even he did not seem sure where back was supposed to be. The crowd began to shift, boots turning, conversations starting up again in low tones, already moving on, already erasing her from their concern, and Elias felt that familiar pull to do the same, to let it pass, to let the town keep its version of order intact. He almost did, almost let the moment close like the others had. But the sound of that word, back, lingered, empty, undefined, and he found himself thinking that some places were not meant to be returned to at all. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in defiance, just in decision, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. And then, before the auctioneer's hand could fall, before the crowd could fully turn away, Elias Carter spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying just far enough to stop the movement without needing to rise above it. "She is not going back." The words settled over the square like dust after a long dry wind, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and for a moment no one moved, as if the town itself had forgotten how to respond to something that did not follow the rules they had grown comfortable with. The auctioneer blinked, his hand still half raised, caught between ending the sale and pretending it had never been challenged. "Not going back," he repeated, the question thin and uncertain, as though he needed to hear it again to believe it had been said at all. A few men in the crowd turned toward Elias now, properly this time, studying him with the slow, measuring look reserved for someone who had just stepped out of line without asking permission. One of them, a broad-shouldered ranch hand with sunburned skin, let out a short laugh under his breath. "Then where is she going?" he asked, not really seeking an answer, more interested in hearing how far Elias intended to take this. Elias did not rush. He stepped forward just enough that the edge of the platform came into clearer view, boots pressing into the packed dirt, leaving marks that would not last long once the wind picked up again, but were there all the same, real, present, undeniable. "With me," he said, simple as that. No explanation, no attempt to soften it for those listening. The reaction came in pieces, a low ripple first, then sharper voices, disbelief wrapped in amusement. "You are taking her," someone called out. "You could not even get a bid started and now you want her," another added. And the laughter grew a little louder, not cruel in volume, but pointed enough to make its meaning clear. The sheriff shifted his stance, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked from Elias to Ayanna and back again, weighing not just the man, but the consequences that might follow a choice like that, because in a place like this, every decision carried further than the person who made it. Ayanna remained still, but there was a change now, subtle, almost invisible, the slightest adjustment in how she held herself, as if something inside her had acknowledged the shift before anyone else could name it. Her gaze did not drop. It never had. But now it rested briefly on Elias, studying him with the same quiet precision he had used on the crowd, measuring not his words, but the space between them. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, louder this time, trying to regain control of something that was already slipping. "You know the terms, Carter," he said, voice tightening. "You take responsibility. You take all of it. No returning what you cannot handle." Elias gave a small nod, not dismissive, not dramatic, just enough to show he understood without needing to speak further on it. "And the price?" the auctioneer pressed, as if clinging to the last piece of order he could enforce. Elias reached into his coat slowly, not to build suspense, but because that was how he moved, deliberate, unhurried. And when he brought his hand back out, there was a single coin resting in his palm, dull from use, catching just enough light to be seen by those closest. He stepped forward and placed it on the edge of the platform, the soft, metallic sound it made against the wood carrying farther than it should have, drawing eyes that had moments ago been ready to look away. "That is enough," he said, not asking, not negotiating, simply stating what he had already decided. The ranch hand shook his head, smirking. "You are paying for trouble," he muttered, but there was less certainty in it now, less ease. The auctioneer hesitated only a second before closing his fingers around the coin, the instinct for transaction stronger than his doubt. "Sold," he declared, the word landing differently this time, heavier, as though it carried more than just the end of a sale. The crowd began to shift again, but not the same way as before, not as quick to dismiss, not as eager to forget, because something about this had not followed the path they expected, and people rarely trust what they cannot predict. Elias stepped up to the platform then, close enough now that the distance between him and Ayanna disappeared entirely, and for the first time since she had been brought there, someone stood beside her not as a buyer, not as an observer, but as something else entirely. He did not reach for her. He did not touch her arm or guide her down. He simply stood there, waiting, as if the next step belonged to her alone. For a moment nothing happened, and that nothing stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the weight of every eye in the square to settle on her shoulders again, waiting to see if she would move, if she would accept, if she would prove them right or wrong in ways they could not quite name. Ayanna lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in consideration, her eyes tracing the edge of the platform, the worn grain of the wood, the faint scuff marks left by others who had stood there before her. And then she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, her bare foot finding the first plank of the narrow stair, as if she had always known it would be there. The boards gave a soft creak beneath her weight, and the sound carried through the quiet like a signal that something had shifted, something small but irreversible. Elias stepped back just enough to give her space, his posture unchanged, his hands resting at his sides, not offering help, not withholding it. Either, simply allowing the moment to unfold without interference. When she reached the ground, the dust rose slightly around her feet, catching in the low light, and for the first time the two of them stood level with each other. No platform, no distance, just the open space of the street between them and the town watching. Up close, the details were clearer, the faint lines at the corner of her eyes that spoke of endurance rather than age, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the quiet strength held in the way she carried herself, as if she belonged to something larger than this place could understand. Elias met her gaze without hesitation, not searching, not demanding, just present, and for a brief second the noise of the town seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the rooftops and the soft shifting of leather as his coat moved with the breeze. "You walk," he said quietly, not a command, not a question, just an acknowledgement that she would choose her own steps. Ayanna studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of something unfamiliar, something that did not fit the pattern she had seen repeated since she arrived in this place. and when she finally nodded, it was small, almost imperceptible, but enough. The crowd began to stir again, voices returning in low murmurs, not as certain as before, not as dismissive, because there is a difference between ignoring something and witnessing it, and they had now witnessed something they did not fully understand. The ranch hand from earlier crossed his arms, watching them with a faint frown. He will regret that. He muttered to no one in particular, though his tone carried less conviction than before. The sheriff took a step forward, his boots pressing into the dirt with a measured weight. "Carter," he called out, not harsh, but firm enough to carry authority. "You know this town does not forget decisions like that." Elias did not turn immediately. He let the words settle, the warning implied rather than spoken, and then he glanced back over his shoulder, his expression unchanged. "Then maybe it is time it remembers something different," he said, the words calm, but anchored in something that did not bend easily. The sheriff held his gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled through his nose and stepped back, not agreeing, not opposing, simply allowing it to pass. Ayanna had already started walking, not ahead of him, not behind, but beside, her pace steady, her steps silent against the packed earth, and Elias fell into stride with her without needing to signal it. The two of them moving through the edge of the crowd as people shifted out of the way, some reluctantly, some without realizing they had done it at all. No one reached out. No one spoke to her directly. But the space they created told its own story, one of distance, of uncertainty, of something they could not control slipping quietly beyond their grasp. The town behind them did not disappear, but it grew smaller with each step, the sounds fading into the background, replaced by the open stretch of land beyond the last building, where the wind moved freer and the horizon widened. After a few yards, Ayanna spoke for the first time, her voice low, steady, carrying no fear, no gratitude, only a question that seemed to weigh more than it should have. Why? The word hung between them, simple, direct, and Elias did not answer right away. He looked ahead, toward the long road leading out of town, the tracks worn into the dirt by years of travel, by choices made and unmade. And then he glanced at her, just briefly. "Because they were wrong," he said, and left it at that, as if anything more would only make it less true. The road stretched ahead in a long pale ribbon, cut through open land that carried the scent of dry grass and distant water, and the further they walked, the more the town behind them seemed to loosen its grip, its voices fading into something less solid, less certain, until it was no longer a place but a memory trailing behind their footsteps. Elias kept his pace steady, not fast, not slow, the kind of rhythm a man learns after years of traveling alone, where each step is measured not by distance but by endurance. And beside him Ayanna moved just as quietly, her presence neither heavy nor light, simply there, like a shadow that did not belong to the ground but followed it anyway. For a while neither of them spoke again, and the silence did not feel empty. It felt intentional, as if words would only interrupt something that needed to settle on its own. A hawk circled high above, its shadow gliding across the earth for a brief second before disappearing, and Elias noticed how her eyes followed it, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that comes from knowing patterns others overlook. He adjusted the brim of his hat slightly, glancing toward the horizon where the faint outline of his ranch lay miles ahead, a place most people would not call much of anything, but it was his, and that had always been enough. After a few more minutes, Ayanna slowed her steps just slightly, enough for him to notice, and when he turned his head, she was no longer looking at the sky but at the ground ahead, her gaze fixed on something small, something most would have stepped over without thought. A broken length of twine lay half buried in the dust, frayed at the ends, worn from use, and she bent down, picking it up with careful fingers, turning it once as if weighing it, then slipping it into the fold of her sleeve without explanation. Elias did not ask. He simply watched, understanding that objects like that did not matter to everyone, but to some they carried meaning far beyond what they appeared to be. They continued on, the land opening wider, the path narrowing into two faint tracks pressed into the earth by wagon wheels long gone, and the wind moved differently out here, less obstructed, carrying a steady whisper that brushed against clothing and skin alike. After a mile or so, the silence shifted again, not broken, but softened, And this time it was Elias who spoke, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "There is water about half a mile ahead," he said, nodding toward a cluster of cottonwood trees barely visible in the distance. "We will stop there." Ayana gave a slight nod, acknowledging the information without question, and they walked on. When they reached the trees, the air felt cooler, the ground softer beneath their boots, and a narrow stream ran through the shade, its surface catching fragments of sunlight between the leaves above. Elias crouched near the edge, dipping his hand into the water, letting it run over his fingers as if testing something more than just its temperature, then stepped back, giving her space without needing to say it. Ayana approached slowly, kneeling at the edge, her reflection wavering slightly in the current, and for a moment she simply looked at it, as if confirming something, before cupping her hands and lifting the water to her lips. The movement was steady, practiced, and when she lowered her hands, a single drop lingered on her wrist, catching the light before falling back into the stream. Elias watched from a few feet away, leaning lightly against the trunk of a tree, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp, and it was then he noticed it, barely visible beneath the edge of her sleeve where the fabric had shifted when she reached forward. A thin band, worn but intricate, wrapped around her wrist, marked with patterns that were not decoration but language, the kind that told a story to those who knew how to read it. He did not stare. He did not step closer. But something in his expression changed, not in surprise, not in fear, but in understanding that whatever he had brought with him from that town was not as simple as they had all believed. Ayana let the water run once more through her fingers, then stood, turning back toward him, her eyes steady, unreadable, and in that quiet space between them, the road ahead seemed to shift again, no longer just a path leading home, but something else entirely, something neither of them had yet named. They left the shade of the cottonwood trees without a word, the coolness fading behind them as the sun reclaimed the open land, pressing heat gently against their backs, and the stream's quiet murmur dissolved into the wider silence of the plains. Elias adjusted the strap on his shoulder, his movements small, habitual, the kind that came from years of carrying only what he needed and nothing more, and he noticed the way Ayana walked now, not just beside him, but aware of everything around them, her steps light, her gaze moving across the land in patterns that did not follow the road but the unseen lines beneath it. The wind shifted again, carrying a different scent this time, faint but distinct, and she slowed for half a second, just enough for him to catch it, her head tilting slightly, as if listening to something far beyond the range of sound most men trusted. He followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just the same stretch of dry earth, scattered brush, and distant hills that had not changed in years, yet something in the air felt altered, not wrong, just watched. He did not speak of it. Instead, he kept walking, letting the silence stretch, because some things revealed themselves better when left alone. After a few minutes, Ayana's hand moved again, subtle, almost hidden, adjusting the edge of her sleeve, and the woven band at her wrist caught a flicker of sunlight before disappearing once more beneath the fabric. Elias had seen enough by now to understand that it was not decoration, not an ornament chosen for beauty, but something older, something carried rather than worn, and the patterns etched into it lingered in his mind, not as shapes, but as meaning he could not yet place. The land began to rise slightly, the path narrowing as it curved between low ridges, and the horizon shifted from wide and open to something more enclosed, more focused, and with that change came a different kind of quiet, one that pressed closer, more immediate. Ayana stopped without warning, her foot halting mid-step before settling into the dust, and Elias stopped with her, not asking why, not moving ahead, simply waiting. She looked toward the ridge to their right, her eyes fixed on a point that appeared empty, and for a long second nothing happened. Then a small movement caught his attention, not in the open, but just beyond it, a flicker of shadow where there should have been none. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough. Elias felt it then, not fear, not exactly, but awareness sharpening at the edges, the kind that told a man he was no longer alone in a place he had walked many times before. He shifted his stance slightly, not reaching for anything, just grounding himself, and glanced at Ayana, who had not moved, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if this was not unexpected, as if this moment had already been accounted for long before they stepped onto that road. "You know them," he said quietly, not a question, just a recognition forming out loud. Ayana did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the ridge, and after a brief pause, she nodded once, slow, certain. The wind passed between them again, carrying the faintest trace of something else now, leather, smoke, and something deeper that did not belong to the town they had left behind. Another flicker of movement appeared, this time further along the ridge, then another, spaced apart, deliberate, not hiding, not revealing, simply there. And Elias understood then that whatever this was, it was not Slucci, not chance, but intention. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and let his hands remain at his sides, resisting the instinct to prepare for something that had not yet shown itself fully. Ayana took a step forward, not toward him, not away, but toward the path ahead, her posture straight, her presence calm in a way that did not ignore what surrounded them but accepted it. "They have been waiting," she said, her voice low, even, carrying no urgency, no fear, only certainty, and the words settled into the space around them like something that had always been true, whether he had known it or not. The air held still in a way that did not belong to open land, the kind of stillness that came not from absence, but from presence waiting to be acknowledged, and Elias felt it settle across his shoulders like a weight he could not see but could not ignore. The ridge to their right remained quiet for a moment longer, the faint movements gone as if they had never been there. But the feeling did not fade. It deepened, sharpening the edges of every sound. The whisper of wind through dry grass, the distant creak of leather as Elias shifted his stance, the quiet rhythm of Ayana's breathing beside him, steady, unbroken. Then, slowly, deliberately, the first figure appeared. Not rushing, not hiding, simply stepping into view along the ridge line as if the land itself had decided to reveal him. He stood tall against the sky, outlined by the fading light, his presence calm, grounded, and behind him, another shape emerged, then another, spaced apart with purpose, not forming a line of threat, but a pattern of control. Elias counted without meaning to, 1, then 3, then 5, each figure positioned where they could be seen, where they chose to be seen, and none of them moved closer, none of them reached for anything. They simply stood, watching. The wind shifted again, carrying clearer now the scent of leather, of smoke that had touched fabric long before this moment, and something older beneath it, something tied to land rather than to men. Ayana stepped forward, just one pace, her movement smooth, unhurried, and the figures on the ridge did not react in surprise. They did not change their stance, but something in the way they held themselves shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like recognition settling into place. Elias remained where he was, not stepping ahead, not falling back, his eyes moving across the ridge, taking in each face as it became clearer, each posture, each detail that spoke without words. There was no chaos here, no confusion, only intention. More figures appeared now, not just on the ridge, but along the slope, emerging from places he had not noticed before, blending into the land until they chose not to, and the number grew, not quickly, not in a rush, but steadily, 1 becoming 5, 5 becoming 10, until the space around them felt smaller without anyone having taken a single step closer. Ayana did not look back at him. She kept her gaze forward, her posture straight, and when she lifted her hand, it was not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen by those who were already watching. The movement was simple, but it carried weight, and the response came not in sound, but in stillness, the figures along the ridge settling into a quiet that felt deliberate, controlled, as if waiting for something that only she could give. Elias felt the moment stretch, the kind of stretch that comes before something changes, and he realized then that whatever he had thought this would be, whatever shape he had given it in his mind, it had already moved beyond that. The ranch, the town, the road behind them, all of it felt distant now, smaller, like pieces of a story that no longer held the center. Ayana lowered her hand slowly, her fingers relaxing back to her side, and only then did she turn her head slightly, not fully, just enough that her voice could reach him without carrying beyond what was necessary. "They came for me," she said, her tone even, certain, and the words did not carry fear, did not carry relief, only truth. Elias nodded once, his gaze still on the ridge, understanding forming not in pieces, but all at once, and when he spoke, his voice remained steady, grounded, and now they know where you are. Iana's eyes shifted then, not to the figures on the ridge, but to him, holding there for a brief second longer than before, and in that look there was something new, not measured, not distant, but chosen, as if she had just made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Then she turned back toward the ridge, took another step forward, and the land seemed to hold its breath with her. The stillness did not break with noise. It shifted with intention, and the figures along the ridge began to move, not forward, not in a rush, but downward in a slow, measured descent that carried no urgency, and yet held complete control over the space around them. One by one they stepped from the high ground, boots finding paths that seemed invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the land, their movements quiet, practiced, as if they had walked this same slope 1,000 times before without leaving a trace. Elias watched closely, his eyes tracking each figure as they came into clearer view, noticing the details now, the patterns woven into their clothing, the way they carried themselves, upright, composed, neither aggressive nor hesitant, and he understood that this was not a gathering formed in reaction. It was a presence that had always been there, simply unseen until this moment. The number grew as they descended, not in chaos, but in order, each man taking a place that felt chosen rather than assigned, until the space before them held more than a handful, more than a dozen, enough to change the balance of any situation without a single word being spoken. Iana did not step back. She did not shift her stance or brace herself. She stood where she was, her shoulders level, her breathing steady, and as the first of them reached the flat of the path, he stopped several yards away, lowering his head just slightly, not as a sign of submission, but of recognition. The others followed, not in perfect unison, but with the same quiet understanding, each one pausing at a respectful distance, forming a wide arc that held both space and presence at the same time. Elias felt the weight of it then, not pressing against him, but surrounding him, the kind of presence that did not need to close in to be felt, and he remained still, his hands relaxed at his sides, choosing not to disturb what was unfolding, because whatever this was, it did not belong to him to interrupt. Iana took one more step forward, closing the distance slightly, and the man at the center of the arc lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes steady, carrying something deeper than simple acknowledgement, something tied to memory, to time, to a connection that did not need explanation. For a moment, nothing was said, and yet everything was understood, the air between them holding a quiet exchange that moved beyond language. Then, slowly, deliberately, the man lowered himself, one knee touching the ground, his head bowing further, and the motion carried through the others like a ripple, not forced, not commanded, but chosen, until the entire line followed, one by one, each figure settling into the same position, the same stillness, the same silent gesture that transformed the space around them completely. Elias felt his breath pause for just a second, not in fear, not in shock, but in the recognition that whatever he had stepped into had just revealed its true shape. This was not a rescue. This was not a retrieval. This was respect. Iana stood at the center of it, unchanged, her posture steady, her expression calm, as if this was not new, not unexpected, but part of something she had always carried within her, whether the world had seen it or not. The wind moved lightly through the space, brushing past clothing and skin, carrying with it the scent of the land, and something else beneath it, something older, something that did not bend to towns or auctions or the judgment of men who measured worth in coins. Elias shifted his gaze from the kneeling figures back to Iana, and for the first time since they had left the town, he saw her not as someone taken from somewhere, but as someone returned to where she had always belonged, and in that quiet realization, the meaning of his choice settled into place, not as a question, but as an answer he had not known he was giving. The silence held for a long moment after the last man lowered himself, the kind of silence that does not demand attention but commands it anyway, and Elias stood at its edge, aware that anything he did now would echo far beyond the space they occupied. Iana remained still, her gaze resting on the man at the center, and slowly she stepped forward until she stood within the arc they had formed, close enough now that the distance between leader and those who followed no longer existed. She did not speak immediately. She let the moment breathe, let the weight of their gesture settle into the ground beneath them, into the air they all shared, and when she finally lifted her hand again, it was not to command, not to signal, but simply to acknowledge. The man before her rose first, not abruptly, but with the same measured control he had shown in kneeling, and the others followed, one by one, until they stood once more, their presence unchanged, but their purpose now clear. Ayana turned then, not back toward the ridge, not toward the path ahead, but toward Elias, her eyes meeting his fully for the first time since the moment they had left the town. There was no distance in her gaze now, no guarded edge, only a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. She stepped closer, closing the last few feet between them, and for a second the world seemed to narrow to that single point of connection, the wind soft, the land still, everything else falling away. "You did not ask who I was," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying a weight that felt both simple and immense. Elias held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes softened, not in doubt, but in understanding. "It would not have changed what I saw," he replied, the words quiet, but anchored in something that did not bend. Ayana studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring that answer against something deeper, something older, and then she nodded once, slow, certain, the same way she had on the road, but this time it carried something more, something chosen. She reached into the fold of her sleeve and drew out the frayed length of twine she had picked up by the stream, holding it for a second before extending it toward him. Elias glanced down at it, then back at her, and though it seemed like nothing, just a worn piece of string, the way she held it told him otherwise. He took it carefully, not questioning, not hesitating, and when it rested in his hand, it felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in meaning. Ayana lowered her hand and stepped back, turning once more toward the others, and with a small movement of her head, the group shifted, not breaking formation, but opening a path, a space that led away from where they stood and toward the land beyond, a direction that did not belong to roads or towns, but to something else entirely. Elias looked at the opening, then back at her, understanding settling into place without needing words, and he gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of respect, the kind that recognizes a choice when it is offered. Ayana did not ask him to follow. She did not tell him to stay. She simply held his gaze for one final second, and in that moment, everything that had passed between them found its place, not as something owed, not as something lost, but as something complete. Then she turned and walked forward, her steps steady, her figure moving into the space that had been made for her, and the others fell in beside her, not surrounding, not guiding, but accompanying, until the group began to move as one, their presence blending once more into the land that had revealed them. Elias remained where he was, the piece of twine still in his hand, the dust settling slowly around his boots, and as he watched them go, he did not feel the absence of what had left, only the quiet certainty of what had been set right. The wind moved again, brushing past him, carrying no voices now, no echoes of the town, only the open stretch of land ahead and the faintest trace of something he could not name but would not forget, and after a moment, he turned back toward the road he had been walking, his steps steady, his path unchanged, but the man walking it no longer the same.